Chewy, quiet down, buddy. Chewy.
All right. Sorry about that feedback. That was just my hype up music and the mic just giving a little bit of high frequency pitchbacks. And basically the live stream being on a 10 to 15-second delay. Sorry about that feedback. That was just my hype up music and the mic just giving a little bit of all right. So thank you all for tuning in and everything like that. We've got people from all over the world, apparently. Obviously some people from Toronto, where I'm based. There's a very exciting, some people from Dubai and from BC joining in. So thank you very much for paying attention. Sorry, not paying attention to this webinar on intermittent fasting. For those of you that know me, my name is Ben, and we're going to go into that in a little bit. But right now, one of the funny things too is you might notice that my voice is a little bit different, and that's largely because last night I was at a heavy metal concert for Slayer. Because I don't know if anyone, I don't think anyone's likely here to know who Slayer is or like Slayer as much as I do, but they're a big thrash heavy metal band that they're on their farewell tour. So my voice is a little bit different, a little bit strained, and a little bit deeper and harsher than normal, so I do apologize for that. But with that being said, I'm just going to get started because there's a lot of information to cover, and I will share my screen right now. So there we go. Sorry for this animation, but all right, there we go. So you're all tuning in to because the ESN Learning Center, which is a learning center I established earlier this year, to start educating people around the world, not just dietitians, but nutrition professionals, as well as the general population, on health and nutrition, especially when it comes to sports and nutrition related topics. The first ESN Learning Center course is about to close the first 3 month access point. That was for the ketogenic diet, obviously, about way back. I can't remember when I did it now, but the ketogenic diet course that's up there. Now, for those of you that are still interested, I have ultimately made a decision to keep it up just because I feel like I'm still getting a lot of requests and a lot of people joining the course, so that I'm just going to keep it up so that people can better enhance and improve their practices, which is exactly what this topic is about: intermittent fasting, what dietitians need to know, because there's obviously a big health trend and fad. Whether or not this is a fad, we'll take a look at the evidence and the research like we did for the keto one, and we'll just kind of explore a little bit today. Now, of course, because this is just a 1 hour webinar, I couldn't go into as much detail as I'd like to go into, but hopefully we can address that as we go along. And I wouldn't be able to look at the questions that you guys might have popping up, but hopefully I can address these questions at a later date, because I am leaving this webinar open for about 2 weeks. So feel free to share with your friends and other colleagues that didn't get a chance to see this today, or in different time zones, or for whatever reason. I just think these things are important to keep up for a short period of time. Before we get started, I really want to give a special thank you and shout out to my intern that is no longer with me. She graduated from my rotation last week. Her name is Elena Stoico. She's a fantastic intern, one of the best I've ever had, and she helped me a lot with this, the research and putting together this webinar for everyone here. So a big thank you and a big shout out goes out to Elena, and I hope you're watching from whichever rotation you're doing right now. I believe it's the inpatient setting that you have. So hopefully you and your preceptor are maybe hunched around a table, but if not, then I hope you're doing some better things or eating some lunch. And to everyone that is eating lunch right now, I hope it's a good one. Let's get started. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Ben, and I'm a registered dietitian specializing in sport. Now, I graduated from the Ryerson Nutrition and Food Program, and I forget which year. Not that it's been that long, I just have a really bad short memory. And this is the, then went on to the Sunnybrook dietetic internship, and this is me with the graduating class. From that point on, I went to work in long-term care for a number of years, but ultimately decided to pursue my passion of sports and nutrition, and enrolled in courses about kinesiology, physiology, exercise science, as well as took the Sports Dietitians of Australia Sports Dietitian Certificate, whereby we started ESN about 3-4 years ago. And it's been going strong ever since. I love to travel the world, and these are pictures from my last vacation of Guatemala and Belize, where we were looking at night markets and food markets and basically how the locals interact, and tasting some of the local delicacies. And it was my favorite thing because the night market picture you see up here on the top right, that is a night market. The funny thing was, you know, dietitians all being foodies at heart, we were having dinner on the patio, and then they started setting up shop, and I was getting excited to eat this night food while I was eating dinner already. So it was a pretty hilarious thing. A lot of people were just like, I can't believe you're a dietitian with the amount that you eat. But of course, that happens when you're a dietitian as well as an athlete. These are pictures of me doing the Chicago Marathon. That was one of the most fun marathon experiences. And unfortunately, last year's marathon, the Montreal Marathon, got canceled because of the extreme heat alert. Hopefully this year I'm registered to run it again. So hopefully I get to run the marathon this year for Montreal. And in a matter of 2 weeks, I will be doing the Guelph Lake 1 Olympic Triathlon. These are pictures of the Muskoka half Ironman that I did about 2 years ago, which is roughly 2.5 kilometer swim, a 90 kilometer bike ride, and a 21.1 kilometer bike. The Olympic is much, much shorter in distance. It's only 1.5 kilometer swim, a 40 kilometer bike ride, as well as a 10K run. So that should be a nice 4 hours that we have going in for the Olympic triathlon. Now, the other thing too is, of course, you might have heard my dog barking in the background while I was playing up my hype up music that gets me in the mood to present. And his name is Chewbacca, and I like to dog shame him on Instagram as well as social media because he doesn't know what's going on, but he clearly sees the shame, as you can see in his face. And of course, you know, he does this really weird thing where he just like puts his face right against mine in the morning. He sniffs it and then sneezes into it, and then he wakes me up and he smiles about it. It's one of the most adorable ways to wake me up, but at the same time, it's one of the most annoying because getting sneezed on first thing in the morning is not exactly my way of starting off the day properly. And the unfortunate thing is there was an announcement that I wanted to make today to all of you watching live, but unfortunately the papers have not been signed yet. So you guys will have to just wait and see. Hopefully next week the papers will come and they'll be signed, but something big is coming for me as well as for the field of dietetics that I'm about to close a deal on. So hopefully we'll get to watch that soon enough. Now, the only reason I do that little bio in the beginning is because I always believe that if the audience knows who the presenter is and the background of the presenter, then it makes for a better presentation, and it breaks down those boundaries. Especially in the online world, it's very, very difficult to have a personalized touch. So knowing who the voice is, the scarred and raspy voice of a heavy metal fan, it definitely helps you kind of absorb the information a little bit more. So let's get down to business right now. The agenda that we have today is that we're going to talk about fasting versus intermittent fasting, what the differences ultimately are, the different types of intermittent fasting, because there are a couple of different types, why people intermittently fast, some of the physiology of fasting. Now, unfortunately, because it's only a 1 hour webinar, I can't get to talk about as much physiology or anatomy or kinesiology as I'd like to. And for those of you that have taken the keto course, you know how much I love exercise science and physiology and kinesiology, and I talk about that a lot and how it relates to the nutrition aspect. Then we're going to talk about fasting versus traditional dieting with some research examples, looking at fasting and exercise and some of the issues, pros and cons and benefits that I've experienced using this eating style for my clients in the bodybuilding world, as well as the sports and nutrition world, as well as everyday clients that are just trying to lose a couple of pounds, and seeing who this is a little bit more beneficial for, who it's more appropriate for, and of course what some of the concerns are that you need to look out for if trying to integrate this into your practice. Now, Like the keto one, again, a lot of people were questioning whether or not I'm an advocate of keto, and I'm guessing the same questions might come into play with intermittent fasting, but whether or not I'm an advocate of intermittent fasting or not, I'm not an advocate of anything other than what works best for the client at hand. So to me, this is another method, means of achieving the same thing that we have all been trained to do. It's just a different approach to it and different set of rules that work for some people and rules that don't work for other people. So I'm just a big fan of finding whatever works best for the person, being open and minded enough to be able to embrace the new and exciting stuff, even though the research has been around about this for quite some time. It's not that new and it's not that exciting, but I guess it's the marketing people that have found a way to make food sexy, which is something that we can all learn from. But of course, this is another way of getting those dietitians that in private practice or their own practice areas, especially, that have clients that say, I want to try intermittent fasting, but I need your help to do it. This is kind of a way to kind of get you a little bit more empowered and feeling a little bit better answering those questions. So let's just dive into it. So the first thing we have to talk about is the definitions, of course. What are we actually talking about? What is fasting? What is intermittent fasting? Now, intermittent fasting and fasting are two separate things. Fasting is the absence of energy, specifically food, and or beverage intake for different kind of time periods. Now, it could be largely unplanned and unstructured, which is where a lot of people come into play with issues with nutrition, in the sense where I always say to people, if we fail to plan, then we plan to fail. Intermittent fasting and fasting is no different. Of course, it requires rules, structures, and guidance in order to be able to succeed at it. Otherwise, you're just literally forgetting to eat, and that happens to a lot of people for a lot of different reasons. Personally, myself, I forget to eat just because, hey, I forgot that I've been working on this project for the last 6 hours, and all of a sudden I took a 5-minute break and my stomach starts growling. What do I do, kind of deal? How do I best eat for that? Those are very common examples. Or for people that are in work situations that don't allow them to eat properly, how do we get around that? Those are unplanned for the most part, unless they're integrating intermittent fasting into their structure. Now, of course, starvation and prolonged fasting is also included into this fasting. That can range, can have a ton of different time ranges, from 2 to 3 days to a week to 70 days to 6 to 8 weeks. I mean, there's a lot of starvation, because we have to remember the body was built to survive, and starvation adaptation protocols will allow the body to feed off of itself to make sure that the organism, the human body, stays alive. Now, in those situations, obviously it's not optimal, and we're looking at optimal, and we're looking at everything that we need to do to make this optimal. And not that intermittent fasting is just starvation protocols. It's definitely not that. But early studies involved, they called them professional fasters or therapeutic fasting, people that just didn't eat for long periods of time. I don't know where professional fasters came into play, because I can't imagine someone would get paid to not eat. That seems like a very, very unethical thing to me. These were categorized by severe caloric restriction of the macronutrients, and dependent on and had significant protein catabolism, which is the tear down of muscle, lean muscle mass. Intermittent fasting is a very, very different beast in itself. It's generally a structured, planned pattern of eating. There's multiple versions of these plans, multiple ways of doing it, and we're going to look at those different versions in a couple of slides. Now, there are various durations with either no food consumption or restricted certain food consumptions, and we're seeing a lot more of those come up in the fad diet world, specifically those people that are advocates of don't combine carbs with fat intake, you'll gain weight that day, whey and everything like that. We don't have enough evidence about that. Of course, my physiology and kinesiology knowledge allows me to predict a couple of things that might happen there. But of course, it's not hard science. It's just based on theory, what would happen there. And so I'm not going to talk too much about that, because I know dietitians and nutrition professionals like the evidence. So we're going to talk more about those things. And of course, they alternate between severely restricted energy intakes for short predefined periods of time to eating to satisfy an appetite. Now, it may or may not have restrictions placed on the types or amounts of foods consumed during the non-fasting periods, and there can be different reasons for this. So, for example, right now it is the Ramadan is going on, where of course there's food restrictions between set on the sunrise and the sunset, and that is essentially intermittent fasting to a big degree, with different time schedules being applied to the level of food restriction. Now, of course, Ramadan's not a diet, it's not a eating style, it's a religious celebration, and there's many reasons why people intermittently fast, but intermittent fasting, the science and the physiology behind it would be applicable to Ramadan, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. The types of intermittent fasting, of course, there is something called alternate day fasting, which is a 24-hour fasting period. That's right, like a full day without eating, followed by a 24-hour feeding period. Now, fasting day can involve no intake or approximately 25% of the energy intake that you normally eat. So it really depends on what is going to work best for that person in that period of time. Alternate day fasting could apply to different people for different reasons. Some shift workers it might be appropriate for. As well, and modified daily fasting is a little bit more appropriate for day shift workers as well, which of course suffer a lot of healthcare issues, in the sense where shift workers statistically are have a twofold risk of developing cancer and have a severe higher risk of developing type 2 diabetes. So of course, shift workers and intermittent fasting, it's a very interesting concept to tie together. The modified daily fasting is of course 1 to 2 or 24-hour fasting periods on non-consecutive days. It can include meal skipping, strategic meal skipping, of course, and it could be, of course, modified daily could involve a 5-to-2 ratio, in the sense where the 5-to-2 ratio is based on the numbers of days. So they would probably have, for example, a very common one would be 5 days fast and 2 days non-fast. So what that would look like for a lot of people is Monday through Friday, they would do intermittent fasting, followed by a 2-day free for all. Now we're going to talk about some of the issues related to that, obviously, in a little bit. And then we have something called time restricted feeding, which is one of the more common and well understood intermittent fasting protocols, which is about anywhere from 16 to 20 hour fast, or 12 to 20 hours actually, with a 4 to 8 hour feed period, or 12 to 12. There's a bunch of different approaches to the time restricted feeding, and we don't have enough time to go into exactly what it's going to be a little bit better for, who this is going to apply better for. But it's one of those things to keep in mind, that there are different types of intermittent fasting, just like there were different types of keto, as I went into with my webinar. So why do people want to intermittently fast? Of course, the first consideration that comes into play is always going to be weight loss and body composition change. It's undeniable that from a research standpoint, the research supports that 5 to 10% body fat decrease will help improve health measures. And of course, for a lot of people too, as much as we don't like to admit, as much as we don't like this method of this reason for weight loss, I should say, of course, aesthetics is a big part of that too. But of course, if their motivation is to get healthier and they end up losing a little bit of weight, then why not? Like, to decrease some chronic disease risks, that would why not? It's just that we want to make sure people are approaching this safely and with good support vehicles in place. It's an alternate strategy to traditional dieting, so continuous energy restriction. Some people are not interested in continuous energy restriction because it just doesn't suit them well. They don't like the idea of we have to reduce constantly, slowly over time. It's just a different strategy. So it's something that could apply better to their lifestyle for whatever reason. It could be a convenient pattern of eating. For example, shift workers might find it a little bit easier to just not eat during periods of time while they're working. And of course, a lot of people could, from a cultural standpoint too, there have been some cultures, I believe in Europe, that have applied intermittent fasting protocols, and not exactly to completely do intermittent fasting protocols, but it's just based on the way they ate from a cultural perspective. They believe that, for example, having a big giant breakfast would be the fuel to fuel them throughout the entire day, and then they would eat very, very little at nighttime. But of course, it's hard to say what is happening there. Of course, a lot of people believe it to be superior to other methods of energy restriction. They will say it's faster, it preserves lean muscle mass. Whether or not it's faster is a different, that's a matter of opinion. There's not much research behind that. But the preservation of lean muscle mass, there is a good amount of literature that says, yes, intermittent fasting will preserve your lean muscle mass. And unfortunately, I don't have enough time to go into the physiology with it. And of course, there are religious and spiritual practices. So Catholic and Orthodox churches, for let's say Lent, people might fast during periods of time, as well as Ramadan. That would also be a kind of religious and spiritual practice as well. The physiology of fasting, I can't go into the deep physiology, but of course there is the difference between an anabolic fed state and the catabolic fasted state. Now, what we have to look at basically is during the fed state, what typically happens is when people, after eating, blood glucose goes up, so does insulin as a means to deal with the increase in blood sugar. The blood glucose is stored in muscle cells as well as adipose tissue. So a lipid is also stored from this perspective, and protein synthesis occurs if the proper eating principles are being followed. And of course, the gluconeogenesis, which is the development of blood sugar, new sugars, either from glucogenic amino acids like alanine and glutamine, or from old sugars. Gluconeogenesis decreases simply just because you're introducing new forms of carbohydrates into the body. It doesn't need to create new forms of carbohydrate for the body to fuel on. The catabolic fasted state. Now, it's interesting because the time windows for catabolism are very individual for a lot of different people. There are a lot of people that will go catabolic after 4 hours of not eating. There are some people that go catabolic after 2 hours of not eating. It really depends on the person, the physiology, the body composition, as well as the types of food they're eating that they have. So the catabolic state is not exactly that well defined as a scientific protocol principle right now. But typically what happens in the catabolic fasted state is we see a decrease in blood glucose compared to the anabolic fed state. We see an increase in the glucagon and a decrease in the insulin. And of course, the glucagon being the hormone that releases blood sugars from your liver to help normalize blood sugar, but also stimulates hunger and appetite to help remind you to eat, to help your blood sugar levels stay normal. Glucose is released, obviously, typically from the liver to help balance out the blood sugars. Like I said, lipids broken down. Now, lipids being broken down, this is highly dependent on a couple of other things too, but there is some lipid breakdown to support gluconeogenesis, either through the and protein breakdown to support the gluconeogenesis. The protein breakdown either from glutamine or alanine, the glucogenic amino acids, or the lipid breakdown to break down the triacylglycerides to get the glycerol backbone to get the glycerol backbone into glycolysis, and then through cellular metabolism. Energy metabolism. Now, the major hormones that are in the fed and fasted states. Oops, sorry, a little typo there. Not faded states. It should be fasted states. So what we've done here, and what Elena worked very hard on, was to develop this this graph for everyone to kind of fully visually understand everything that happens within the fed and fasted states. So, of course, fed state, the insulin is expected to go up, as well as a decrease in glucagon. Now, the insulin going up, that is dependent on the meal composition that you have, so the macronutrients at your meal, and glucagon going down. In terms of epinephrine, cortisol, which is a stress hormone, growth hormones, the thyroid stimulating hormones, TSH, T3, and T4, leptin, these are all dependent on the the timing of the meals, so whether or not something was a meal was timed out properly or not, or they went too long without eating, or if they depending on the meal composition themselves. So these could be either plus or minus depending on what foods were eaten and in what quantities that they were eaten in. Ghrelin will decrease a little bit, and of course ghrelin's the hormone that helps activate hunger. Was one of the hormones, one of the physiological changes that helps increase hunger. So ghrelin decreases during the fed state. Now, during the fasted state, the insulin decreases, obviously, because there's no blood sugars rising. Glucagon increases again to help increase blood sugar levels, as well as stimulate a little bit of hunger. Epinephrine, norepinephrine, these hormones, they increase, as well as cortisol, the stress hormone. Growth hormone surprisingly increases, and the thyroid stimulating hormone increases. Leptin decreases, which is leptin is of course released after from your adipose tissue to suppress appetite after you've eaten. That obviously will decrease because if you're in a fasted state, there's no point of your body releasing leptin from the adipose tissue, and of course ghrelin increases. Now, the interesting thing is, this is what one of the most interesting things about intermittent fasting is. If we look at the changes in these hormones when compared to the fasted state to the acute exercise bout, we see practically the exact same changes from a fasted state to an acute exercise bout. So this could be one of the many reasons why this might be effective as a diet strategy or a nutritional strategy to help decrease fat in the body and maintain lean muscle mass. Because in the acute exercise bout, as you can see right next to the fasted state, there are pretty much the exact same changes with the exception of ghrelin, which ghrelin has no change for, because obviously, it depends on the type of physical activity there. And this is where everything gets a little bit more complicated, because physical activity obviously has different roles in the body and different intensities and different kind of types. So if you're doing weightlifting, that's a very, very different physiology response than, let's say, a light run or a yoga workout. So there's a lot of different feeding strategies that have to be matched to the different exercise protocols that are coming. And of course, I'm hard at work for those of you that this graph raises more questions than it answers. I am hard at work at developing a sports nutrition course for the ESN Learning Center. So hopefully that can come out sometime this year, but there's a lot of work involved in that. So could we say that fasting mimics physical activity? Absolutely not. But hormonally, it does. And that's a very, very, very interesting thing about the intermittent fasting and acute exercise. Now, typically, I didn't want to talk about this, but intermittent fasting and keto, because they're going hand in hand right now, with a lot of these doctors out there promoting keto as well as intermittent fasting, a lot of them are combining the both of them together. Now, of course, fasting promotes a glucose depleted state, and it's said that intermittent fasting with keto principles put together helps put someone in a state of ketosis a lot faster. Of course, for me personally, I believe intermittent fasting and keto should be kept separately, because I think they're very, very different things. Although I think they're, very strict enough as it is that you don't need to combine all those things together. I think that increases the risk of disordered eating and false food beliefs. So I'm not the biggest fan of combining that, but it has to be addressed in this presentation. And of course, for those of you that are a little bit more interested, you can definitely check out the keto course that I have up right now. Now, what happens is during fasting and keto put together, insulin decreases, which is not a surprise, and glucagon increases to promote as one of the means to help promote fatty acid oxidation. We get an accumulation of acetyl-CoA, and for those of you that are a little bit lost right now, this is where the biomechanics and bioenergetics come into play for cellular metabolism, in the sense where what we have here in this graph right here is we have the beta oxidation, so that's fat oxidation. We have citric acid cycle, which is carbohydrate metabolism essentially, and we have, of course, in here we have the breakdown glycolysis. So what glycolysis does is the first step of all energy metabolism, dependent on oxygen availability and physical activity. Glycolysis will produce pyruvate. Pyruvate then either attaches to acetyl-CoA down here, and then that allows it to enter the citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle in the presence of enough oxygen. And then the citric acid cycle, depending on of course, the amount of oxygen, will allow it to go to the rest of the molecules to go to beta oxidation. So acetyl-CoA can be again converted to ketones in the body, and ketones can be used by the central nervous system for energy in gluconeogenesis. Now, it's important to know that during a state of keto, not all body tissues can use ketones as an energy source, and these ketones are beta hydroxybutyric acid, acetoacetate, and I forget the third one. I'm sorry. Oh wait, of course, that's the one similar to nail polish remover, acetoacetate. Yeah, sorry. So what happens here is the acetyl-CoA allows it to go through citric acid cycle, and with ketosis, it doesn't combine with acetyl-CoA. Well, actually, no, I'm sorry. I got to backtrack on that. I'm a little bit confused right now. But what happens is there's an accumulation of acetyl-CoA, and that's where the glycolysis typically happens to help burn the fatty acids. There we go, back on track. Intermittent fasting may not lead to increased ketones, as the window of fasting window may not be long enough. And of course, the intermittent fasting and ketosis is highly dependent on your carbohydrate intake. So if someone's intermittently fasting for, let's say, 16 hours a day, not eating, and then all of a sudden introducing a lot of food in, specifically carbohydrates, they will never enter a state of ketosis, because the body needs to have a 1 to 2 week adaptation period with a lot of side effects in order to enter a state of ketosis, and that's dependent on the amount of ketone bodies being produced in your body. Intermittent fasting itself will increase ketone bodies, but that alone will not cause a state of ketosis to burn fat more effectively with a ketogenic diet. So IF plus ketogenic diet protocols is just further energy restriction with change in the macronutrients to facilitate ketosis. IF alone cannot facilitate ketosis unless you're doing, for example, a 1 month fast, which has been done before medically supervised, which is kind of crazy to me from a research standpoint. I don't think they can ever get research ethics to pass that now. But it's been done in the past and it's been researched. Of course, these are case studies and they're very, very interesting. But yes, it's been done before. I highly would not suggest that because it just doesn't seem practical and it seems like there's a lot more risks involved than anything else. But I digress. The metabolic adaptations to prolonged fasting. Now, the reason for bringing up fasting in the beginning and intermittent fasting is related to how the body will adapt to the fasting protocols. Of course, with intermittent fasting, it doesn't adapt the same way as it does with prolonged fasting. This is why when people have constant continuous energy restriction well below their calculated or measured energy requirements, there's huge changes to the basal metabolic rate. It decreases significantly. It reduces the rate of physical activity or the energy cost of physical activity. So basically the same amount of physical activity that you're doing burns less calories. And this is true for all physical activity, not just adaptations from prolonged fasting. And there's a lot of different training principles around that and a lot of sports nutrition principles around that. But essentially, the adaptation or decreased energy cost related to physical activity is best explained from one of the metaphors that I like to use a lot. If you've ever seen an overweight mail carrier, it doesn't make a lot of sense because from a theoretical standpoint, the mail carrier is active on their feet for about 6 to 8 hours a day. They're moving around, they're carrying the bag of mail that they have to deliver, and that bag of mail is of course, heavy, providing a cardio element as well as a resistance training element to their jobs. But what happens is that because their body's so used to the same level of physical activity over and over and over through the years, their body actually burns less calories doing that physical activity. So they start to gain weight, even though they are physically active for 6 to 8 hours a day with energy, weight applied to their physical activity. And of course, the cardio that they're doing is within the aerobic energy metabolism, which helps them burn fat. There's also adaptive thermogenesis and changes in circulating hormone concentrations. So the adaptation for prolonged fasting increases cortisol, which is the stress hormone that tears apart lean muscle mass, as well as promotes fat increase. Decreased leptin. Of course, leptin being the adipose tissue hormone that signals to the body that you're full. Decreased insulin as a response to decreases in your carbohydrates, and increased ghrelin, which is the hunger hormone that one of the hormones that stimulates your hunger. So, of course, the elephant in the room is talking about intermittent fasting and weight loss. A lot of people use IF for weight loss and weight control, I should say, for many different reasons. So we have to explore that right now within this the confines of this webinar. So the first thing we have to do is obviously look at research, and some of the research that we found that we really enjoyed here is the comparison of intermittent fasting versus traditional diets by Simon and everyone else there. So the study details are, they define two research groups here from this meta-analysis: intermittent energy restriction groups and continuous energy restriction groups, which are basically traditional diets. Our traditional negative 500 calories per day to produce 1 to 2 pounds of weight loss per week is the continuous energy restriction group there. And the intermittent fasting group is restricting energy intake by varying degrees for a predefined period of time. So what we have there is looking at the different methods of intermittent fasting that I talked about earlier in this webinar. So multiple day fasting, alternate day fasting, or time restricted fasting. Now, the purpose was to determine if there was any evidence that intermittent fasting may reduce or fail to induce adaptive responses to energy restriction or improve efficiency of weight loss. So basically, they were looking at what the difference was in IER versus CER. The inclusion criteria were that they looked at human trials, randomized control groups, and pilot studies, with or without a continuous energy restriction control group. But they did include the BMI minimum was 20 and the maximum was 45. And in 31 out of the 40 trials, the participants were overweight to begin with, and seeing what the weight, basically IF could do for their weight loss. They measured body weight, BMI, or body composition, and before and after their basically their changes, their intermittent fasting. The exclusion criteria included anyone on bariatric surgery, diagnosis of cancer, Crohn's disease, or taking medications designed to induce weight loss. So this would include appetite suppressants, hormonal therapy, changes to help with leptin or ghrelin or anything like that. Those studies would be excluded. The total number of studies used for the systematic review are 40. 12 actually directly compared the effectiveness of intermittent fasting to continuous energy restriction. IF included, of course, alternate day fasting, short periods of energy restriction during a fasting phase, longer periods of severe energy restriction, and of course, moderate energy restriction during the fasting phase of the intermittent fasting protocol. The majority involved short intermittent fasting regimens of 1 to 7 days of severe energy restriction, alternating periods with moderate energy restriction or no energy restriction. So on the short IF days, there was a severe restriction, as well as on the moderate restriction days, there was still a restriction there. So it appeared that the majority of the studies had intermittent fasting protocols combined with continuous energy restrictions in general. So it wasn't a free-for-all, here's the day where this is when you were eating and this is when you were not eating. It appeared that they all had research looking at this is when you would eat, and this is on the 3-day, so to speak. This is what you would target as well. So it's not like a free-for-all, a binge, or anything like that. The other items to include were the sample participants were 17 to 79 years old, and the most common sample sizes were between 30 to 60 participants of those studies looked at. The intervention duration was the most common, was about 12 to 13 weeks, so about 3 months. And of course, there were some that looked at 2 to 104 weeks, so really, really long-term stuff there. So they were looking at, of course, whether or not intermittent fasting provided physiological benefits or metabolic advantage or cause a greater fat loss over continuous energy restriction for weight management. So what did they find? Well, the first thing they found was the weight loss was comparable between IF and continuous energy restriction. So they found decreased BMI, waist circumference, and hip circumference in both groups. So like I said before at the beginning of this, IF isn't better or worse, just like keto isn't better or worse. It's just a different way of doing it that might benefit someone a little bit better based on variables beyond their control. For example, their work schedule. And it also has a couple of easier messages to parlay across. The fat mass was comparable between intermittent fasting and continuous energy restriction. But this is the part that was a little bit more interesting. The fat-free mass, so the lean muscle mass, had a decrease or no change after the intermittent fasting control group. Now, the interesting thing is to say here would be, how did they look at that? Did they look at it with BMI? Was that studied through BIA, so bioelectric impedance, skin fold assessments, dual electric DEXA scans, or underwater weighing or BOD pods. These methods of gathering body composition data are very, very important because there's nuances between each one. And of course, they looked at drive to eat. So they looked at, and this is an interesting finding that too, that they found that intermittent fasting groups may have lessened the drive to eat. So continuous energy restriction, they found that there was hunger signals there, versus intermittent fasting people had a decrease in hunger signals over time. So this is very, very interesting, because they were able to eat less, and they were craving less, and they were feeling more full. Now, the contributions to this was maybe a decrease or change in appetite, a decrease in leptin, and weight loss. No real change in ghrelin or an increase in ketones, because ketones have been theorized to be appetite suppressants themselves, which is very, very interesting and exciting. Now, one of the things to keep in mind here too is this is one thing I've noticed with, and I'm going to say this right now, and a lot of you are going to cringe, and I know that, when we look at cleanses and detoxes, this might explain why a cleanse or a detox works to help people lose weight. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but it's infuriating when I talk to people. They're like, I'm doing this cleanse, I'm doing this detox, and I'm like, okay, how'd that going for you? And then they actually respond, actually, it's going great. It's going very, very well. I'm eating less. I'm feeling a little bit better energetically and all that kind of stuff. And it's infuriating because it's counterintuitive to what we know as dietitians and from the research that we were trained with. But this might explain it. It might not be the cleanse or the detox supplements that they're buying themselves, but the sheer act of they're engaging in an intermittent fasting protocol once or twice a month. And that could be helping them decrease their hunger signals and increase their satiety rates and the fullness at meals. So it's one of those things where I don't know where the origin of cleanses or detoxes came from, but it could be one of those things where someone's like, okay, intermittent fasting works, but how do we sell this and make profit off of it? How do we increase our profits? Could we sell them a supplement that helps that is supposed to cleanse out their liver or whatever? But I mean, I've been looking at this and I've been questioning this a lot. Is this the mechanism for why cleanses and detoxes actually work for some people to help them lose weight? I don't know. I don't know personally, because there's no research directly looking at cleanses or detoxes. But what we do know is that from a research standpoint, a cleanse or a detox, the supplements don't work, but something there is. So could it just be the intermittent fasting that is causing them to decrease their hunger, increase their satiety at meals, and increase their fullness at meals, and cause these hormonal changes to leptin and ghrelin and maybe their appetite suppression, which is very effective for some people? We don't know. I don't know for 100%, but I have a high suspicion that it is more related to intermittent fasting than it is to the supplements, because there's proven evidence that the supplements there don't work. They just cleanse everyone of their wallet, not their liver or anything like that. But for those of you that are frustrated, that's one of the things I've been looking at recently in my research on all these different topics. Anyways, for mood, which is an important thing, because like those of you involved, if I'm ever hungry, I'm hangry. So it's inconsistent results. Actually, there's a lot of people that had, increased mood swings, depression, anger. That's me, obviously. If I don't eat every 3 to 4 hours, I am angry, and it's not nice to see me. It's a public health hazard when that happens. They have maybe reported some mood swings, loss, concentration, lack of concentration, energy, or quality of life. But there's another group that said they had better energy, increased quality of life, less mood swings, lack of concentration. We don't know, because the science didn't dive into the nutrition as much as we'd like it to. Of course, what were their meals like? What was the glycemic index of the food like? What was their portion sizes? What was their energy restriction? What were all these different things going on? Of course, this is the limitation behind a systematic review, is that you don't get to dive into those things as much as you'd like them to do. Now, the adaptive responses to energy restriction, there was no evidence that intermittent fasting reduced these adaptive responses. So there was no change in resting energy expenditure, which is really, really nice for us to know. The energy cost of physical activity, there was no change there. And the hormonal changes, there was no change in thyroid hormone, cortisol, or ghrelin, or leptin, but there was a decrease in leptin. So that was very interesting, because of course it goes to it just supports that graph I put up earlier. And of course the glucose homeostasis, there were improvements in the intermittent fasting group and comparable to the continuous energy restriction groups. But of course the intermittent fasting protocol group had statistically a little bit better control there. So decreased glucose and decreased insulin, suggesting increasing insulin sensitivity. So that's really, really cool stuff. So one, of course, how to increase insulin sensitivity for type 2 diabetics and people in general that have insulin issues and sensitivity issues is, of course, physical activity and weight loss. Could fasting be another method to help increase insulin sensitivity? We'll just have to take a look into more research. And of course, with those studies that had exercise combined with intermittent fasting, it did lead to greater weight loss. The limitations, of course, were 12 out of the 40 included directly of the research papers directly compared intermittent fasting to continuous energy restriction. But how did they do that? What was their body compositions? How were meals measured? What nutrition advice were they given? That we didn't really get to find out. There were tons of differences in study design, intervention, and the participant characteristics, as well as demographics. And there's insufficient data to basically conclude intermittent fasting influences body weight, fat-free mass, fat mass, or the adaptive responses to glucose homeostasis that are different from continuous energy restriction. And of course, like all research, we need more research and we need long-term studies. Overall, what we've been able to conclude from this review is that intermittent fasting leads to weight loss. So it is effective, but it's not superior to continuous energy restriction. So with that being said, it's like I said before at the beginning of this, it's not better, or it's just different. It's just a different method of achieving something that may work better for someone that, that has a harder time understanding the nuances and difficulties of traditional dietetic practice. It might be easier to say, okay, between these periods of time, that's when you're allowed to eat. After that, no eating, to help them with their weight loss. It's, like I said, it's just a different approach to the same thing that we're doing. So let's take a look at fasting and exercise, because of course, ESN being a sports nutrition focused company, we are definitely more interested in the exercise component. So we found research that looked at alternate day fasting on exercise and eating behaviors and weight loss. but from Bhutani and everyone else. The inclusion criteria, there was about 64 participants, 25 to 65 years old. The BMI was 30 to 39. They were stable weight for 3 months and lightly active. The exclusion criteria included no history of cardiovascular disease, no history of bariatric surgery, no weight loss, or blood glucose lowering meds. In 12 weeks, the activity group, the exercise group, the ADF group plus exercise control. So they all had some sort of intervention. So alternate day fasting, exercise, and alternate day fasting plus exercise, and a control group that basically had nothing. What they did was for 12 weeks, 25% of the caloric intake on fast days, and there's no restriction on feed days. So basically, what your calculated energy requirements are for those people, they only fed them 25% of the calories on their fasting days, and there was no instruction giving on feeding days. And they were given moderate intensity physical activity 3 times a week for 12 weeks, which is stationary, bicycle, and elliptical, which is important because this is very much along the lines of what a lot of people are capable of in terms of physical activity, because sports nutrition is not all just about Olympic athletes. It's about basically what the body goes through during different physiological states for exercise science. The findings were that there was a greater weight decrease in the alternate day fasting group showed a weight decrease. Exercise and activity alternate day fasting group, sorry about that, had more weight loss. The waist circumference was greatest in the alternate day fasting and exercise group. The hunger, fullness, and satisfaction signals were this. The alternate day fasting had decreased hunger and increased fullness after 12 weeks. Alternate day fasting plus exercise had decreased uncontrolled and emotional eating. So they decreased the amount of stress eating they had or emotional eating they had, and there was no change in fullness, satisfaction, or hunger compared to the alternate day fasting group. And the exercise group had basically no change in eating behaviors overall. The overall findings were exercise plus alternate day fasting improved eating behaviors in obese individuals, and the exercise did not increase the likelihood of cheating if done on the fast day. So basically, those little cheat meals that they'd have, or like meals that are unaccounted for, that are the bane of our existence, it didn't change at all for those groups. And endurance training can be incorporated safely into an alternate day fasting program. So very exciting stuff. Now I'm just realizing the amount of time that I have left for this 1 hour webinar. So unfortunately, there are 2 studies that I would love to be able to talk about, but I can't right now just because we have to keep moving. Everyone's got to get back to work, and I got to keep this under an hour because I got to get back to work. So here's some other research that we looked at by Toro and al. That you should definitely take a look at. What we looked at in terms of strength and body composition. I'll just jump right to the finding. The time-restricted fasting group was able to maintain muscle mass, reduce body fat, and improve some health-related biomarkers with resistance training combined with intermittent fasting or time-restricted fasting. And of course, other studies on metabolic health, they're finding that there is a possible cardioprotective effect after 3 weeks of alternate day fasting. They found groups had decreased triglyceride levels and increased HDL, high-density lipoprotein cholesterol in the blood, which is, of course, the good cholesterol. After 8 weeks, the alternate day fasting groups had decrease in triglycerides, LDL, and SBP. Oh God, I forgot what the SBP was. And of course, the effects on diabetes were inconsistent. So the inconsistency could be more related to what instructions they were given. Because of course, if someone was a diabetic was given like, this is your fast day and this is your non-restricted day, and they're just binging on carbohydrates, of course, that's going to surge and change the A1C as well as the blood sugar control levels. So it's inconsistent there. So it needs a little bit more support for the diabetic population. In terms of the animal studies, The effects of fasting on health indicators show an increase in insulin sensitivity. But of course, these are rat studies as well as rabbit studies or everything like that. So they never really translate to human studies, but we are starting to see more human studies supporting these findings in animal studies. They're also seeing decreases in blood pressure, body fat percentage, insulin release, glucose, lipids, and inflammation. So that's very, very exciting. But of course, we need to be able to support this with human research. So hopefully more of it comes soon. And of course, intermittent fasting may improve lipid profile in healthy, obese, and dyslipidemic men and women. Of course, like I said before, more studies, and that's not a surprise for all research. I wanted to go into Ramadan right now, but unfortunately, like I said before, there is no time. So this is research by Khalid Trabelsi. Sorry, I can't pronounce names to save my life. Where they looked at fasted state resistance training during Ramadan on body composition and selected metabolic parameters in bodybuilders. So this was some really, really exciting stuff for this population. And what they found was there were no significant change in body mass or body composition of bodybuilders after 4 weeks in either group of during the Ramadan fasting. That's because everyone was fasting during this time. There was an increase in blood electrolytes and renal function markers in both groups, but it was explained by a chronic state of mild dehydration in both groups during that time. The increase in high-density lipoprotein was related to Ramadan fasting. There was no change in LDL or total cholesterol or triglycerides in this group, but of course, this is a group that was very active to begin with in terms of physical activity. So I mean, whether or not those were in normal ranges or healthy ranges is most likely the case. But of course, if they did this in if they did this study in in a population that wasn't physically active, we typically see changes and decreases in the LDL as well as total cholesterol and triglycerides. There was no change in energy intake or macro distribution before or after Ramadan within these groups, and that's because they are bodybuilders who are very, very tightly watching their nutrition and their diet in order to best stimulate lean muscle mass growth, muscle protein synthesis, as well as the hormonal changes that come with that. Now, the issues related to intermittent fasting. Is there increased hunger? In certain populations, there is, and that's largely depending on how they change up their macronutrients. It may lead to ketosis or other metabolic adaptations if you're not careful watching the time frames and the restrictions there, and of course the macros again, and it may lead to disordered eating because that's one of the biggest myths that I hate is, oh, I can't eat past 8 p.m. otherwise this will happen. It may actually be more related to the feeding windows of intermittent fasting as opposed to a hard set rule of 8 p.m. So it's a lot of disordered eating or false food eating beliefs that may be related to intermittent fasting if it's successful. But what we do have is changes in body composition in regards to fat mass and fat-free mass, and the long-term safety element of it. Is this safe long-term? I mean, the majority of the research that we reviewed and that is out there is typically 3 months. So what is the long-term effect for? And of course, what we have to consider is who is this for? We have to consider many different variables in regards to health, age, their lifestyle, their activity levels, occupation, as well as their health and fitness goals. So intermittent fasting, like I said, is a different way of achieving something, but it may not be appropriate to everyone, and there's a lot of different variables in play. The benefits of intermittent fasting are, of course, it can be effective for weight loss and fat loss, improve glucose homeostasis and insulin sensitivity with a lipid profile, and what's combined with fasted training and can lead to increased weight loss and opportunity for greater fatty acid oxidation. However, this is a very sports nutrition centric eating style where we talk about fasted training and how to optimize fat loss there, and what kind of training zones, what workouts are more appropriate for that. And of course, one of the benefits that I've always found with IF is that sometimes it's just a lot easier for someone to conceptualize, to follow, and it may be a little bit less restrictive in regards to the foods that they're eating. So for example, some clients of mine, they're like, listen, I want to do this, and this, but I don't want to eat kale. I don't want to eat chia seeds. I don't want to eat this. I don't want to change my food choices around in order to do that. Can this still be done? We've tried intermittent fasting, and yes, it could be done because they were happier doing that, knowing that they could still eat their favorite foods, and just a couple more rules applied to it in order to achieve their weight loss. Did it achieve it in the best way possible? No. But did it, but obviously with time, I was able to change their eating principles in general. So let's say someone that's highly dependent on fast food, like a trucker or something like that. We started intermittent fasting, and it really worked well for him, knowing that his food access wasn't about to change anytime soon, and started to help him lose a little bit of weight, actually a good amount of weight actually. And what we would do is just basically worked on what was realistic, what wasn't, and what was the best way to do certain things, and get his nutrition under wrap down. And these are the kind of creative little solutions that I like to find for my clients to be able to help them reach their goals, even if they're in especially if they're in situations where they cannot change their environment. But anyways, so this is coming out of nowhere, but of course, with the webinar, now that you've learned a lot more about intermittent fasting, I want to announce that there's an intermittent fasting course that starts on June 13th of this year. So 2 weeks from now, there's going to be an intermittent fasting course on the ESN Learning Center. The modules include the physiology of intermittent fasting, so basically what happens in the muscular level, the cellular level, and how to do this, the different types of intermittent fasting, and which types of intermittent fasting are more appropriate for which populations. We will talk about those and how to strategize that to make intermittent fasting and optimize body composition change. So how to best have intermittent fasting protocols and different meals and different timings of meals to optimize preservation of lean body mass, as well as increasing beta oxidation fat mass. How to optimize physical activity for intermittent fasting. So talking about the sports nutrition principles and combining intermittent fasting together to help increase lean muscle mass or burn fat more effectively, and how to do certain workouts fasted optimally for certain people. And of course, looking at the psychosocial considerations of intermittent fasting, what in my experience working with bodybuilders, physique competitors, as well as everyday people, what counseling strategies need to be taken into consideration, because it's not as simple as don't eat between these times. There's a lot of psychosocial things that need to be taken into consideration. And of course, transitioning out of intermittent fasting and maintaining those results. Some people are not happy doing this long term, and that's more than understandable, especially for those that are hangry. But of course, if we can help them lose the weight and hit their goal, then we can transition them out of intermittent fasting without affecting anything and still help them maintain their results. Very similar to the keto program, in the sense where we would use keto to help burn fat, maintain less muscle mass, and of course, how to transition them off of that eating style into a quote unquote more regular routine eating style to better support certain things, like maybe someone wanting to increase their lean muscle mass, and we would have to transition them out of intermittent fasting for that to best support muscle protein synthesis. Now, for the discount code that I have right now, to make sure everyone gets a fair chance at this, I have ESN LCIF as the discount code, which is available from today all the way to June 27th, so a full month. So you have time to mull over that decision. If you need time to talk to your supervisors to get funding for this or anything like that, we would that's to take that into consideration, to give you a full month's time in order to do that, as well as for the parents out there that are busy doing end of school stuff with their kids, to basically allow them to still have the product discount code after school is out for summer. The original price, it goes back to the original price of $195 after that. So it does go live today, and classes start June 13th. And this is very similar to the keto course, where we have 6 modules, 1 module delivered per week on Wednesday before noon, and we will also have case studies, as well as quizzes and supplemental reading and research that I give out to help better understand intermittent fasting, the physiological changes that someone goes through, as well as how to practically apply it to clients and which clients are going to be better for. So that's something to consider for you that are looking more into this and or have been approached by many clients or people in that have recently asked you about intermittent fasting to address their goals, and you just haven't felt empowered or with enough resources or tools to be able to help them with their decisions that they have made. So it's just another way of helping everyone out to see the success I've seen in my clients and my athletes, to be able to use just another method to achieve the same achieve results in different populations that have different lifestyle restrictions and different barriers to their weight loss. So here's the boring part, again, the references that get put into place. And I want to thank Elena again for doing the research. I'm sorry, I'm going to pull this back and come back to my face now. Right. There we go. Great. Awesome. So thank you all for watching. And I want to be able to, and like I said before, I will keep this webinar open for 2 weeks. So after this webinar has gone out, I will send out the access link. Now, of course, this is an unlisted video. The reason for that is because I don't want public viewers to be able to see this. I want this to be only for nutrition professionals like dietitians, as well as anyone else looking to integrate nutrition into their practice. Because this is a more professional side of the video. There's going to be a general access one for the healthy living populations coming in a few weeks after that. And of course, so I'm going to sign off now. I know it's about 1 o'clock and everyone's starting, and my voice is getting a little bit strained, and I need to rest it a little bit, the vocal cords, after some screaming last night from the heavy metal concert. But I want to thank you all again for watching today, and please like, comment, share. Let us know what you think about this, as well as what you'd like to see from the ESN Learning Center in the next coming months, because we are working hard to develop a lot of other courses for a lot of dietitians, nutrition professionals, and the everyday athlete. So please let us know what you think, if there's stuff that you would like us to take a look into for you, and create webinars for, and of course, ESN Learning Center courses. Thank you again for watching, and I'll post the link of the replays or the links as soon as I get them after this, and as soon as I do a little bit of video editing. Thanks again for watching from all over the world, and this is Ben again signing off. Thank you, and have a healthy and happy day. Bye.